ICT research collaboration with Australia. So this webinar represents the final event in the EPIC project in Australia, which will wrap up at the end of July. And the purpose of this webinar is to provide some information on collaboration and funding opportunities between the European Union and Australia. The aim here is really to support European researchers in the field of information and communication technologies who have an interest in collaborating with partners in Australia. And today we'll have some experts in EU-Australian research collaboration who will be providing us with some insights into the Australian research and innovation environment and some information on current funding opportunities. Now, for those who aren't aware of EPIC, EPIC is the European Pacific Partnership for ICT collaboration in research, development and innovation. And the aims are to strengthen the ties between the regions of Australia, New Zealand and Singapore with the European Union through academic, industrial and political partnerships. The project was initiated by the European Commission and receives funding from Horizon 2020 and promotes research and development in various future-oriented areas, things like artificial intelligence, digital single market and spatial intelligence. By way of introduction, my name is Jonathan Arthur. I'm the National Services Manager at Intersect Australia. And Intersect is very proud to be one of the partners of EPIC, one of the partner organisations. Intersect is a not-for-profit, member-based organisation that works with researchers and with research-intensive organisations to help them conduct research faster. So our goal is really to work with researchers in our member organisations and other customers, which includes 12 universities throughout Australia, in order to be able to provide a range of digital products and services that help people, researchers, to be either more productive, so help them to reduce the time it takes to move from a hypothesis to a tested result, or to be more diverse in their research outcomes by sharing their information and the data that they collect more widely and to more effectively enable those research collaborations. And we also care about longevity of data, so thinking about how data is stored beyond the end of one particular research project so it can continue to inform and enable research in the field. And in order to do this, we work in a range of different areas, including data storage, compute, software engineering, training and education services, consulting, and so forth. And we've been doing that for over 10 years. And because part of our focus is really about enabling collaborations amongst researchers, there's a really natural fit for us in terms of working as one of the partner organisations with EPIC. Now, in terms of introducing our speakers today, we have two speakers. The first will be Dr. Rado Faletic, Australia's foremost expert on the European Union's Research and Innovation Program. And our second speaker is Dr. Anthony Peacock, the CEO of the Cooperative Research Centres in Australia. And you can see their biographies online at the moment as part of the webinar. Now, we did have Christelle Nolte from the Department of Industry, Innovation and Science, who was originally scheduled to be our first speaker. However, due to some technical issues, she's been unable to join, and Rado will present in her place. Just in terms of housekeeping for the audience, if you do have questions, we ask that you just hold those until the question and answer period in the final 10 minutes of the webinar. And there is a chat box that you should be able to see at the bottom right-hand corner in which you can type a question, or if you would like to pose your question live, just indicate in the chat box that that's the case and we can enable your microphone and webcam and allow you to do that. Okay, so I think we're kind of through all of the preliminaries, and so at this point, without any further delay, I'd very much like to welcome our first speaker, Rado Faletic. Thanks, Rado.
Thanks, Jonathan. So I will give a rather quick and lightweight snapshot of Australia to give you a perspective of the Australian science and technology landscape. And I'll try to focus particularly on the opportunities in the ICT space. As you can imagine, Australia does much more than just ICT, but I won't cover any of those details today. But first, what I'll do is just some quick statistics, which may be surprising to many people who don't already know Australia. Obviously, people are aware it is a rather large country. However, you don't know that it's nearly twice the size of the EU in terms of land mass, but very little of it is actually arable land. It's one of the largest economies in the world, and one of the richest countries in the world also. But however, it's fairly sparsely populated. And to demonstrate the degree of urbanisation, our two largest cities, Melbourne and Sydney, they account for almost half of our population. And by that measure, we're one of the most highly urbanised countries in the world. The Australian dollar is one of the most highly traded currencies, even though we are a relatively small population. But as another demonstration of the wealth of the country, we're very high on the Human Development Index and other indexes as well, such as the freedom measures and livability measures. And our cities often appear in the most livable cities in the world lists. And for some of these reasons, Australia is a very nice, very happy, and very easy place to collaborate with. As you see on some of the points on this slide, actually. But to start with, one of the quirks of the Australian research landscape is we have a dominance of public funding in our system compared with many other nations. That is both a strength and it's also a disadvantage in some other respects. But from a collaboration perspective, it's a huge plus. All of our competitive funds, well, most of our competitive funds are actually from the federal government. I'm going to be talking about some of those in a moment. And Tony Peacock will focus on the CRCs, which are particular interest to collaborators. We have a set of national research priorities. And for those of you who are familiar with the framework programs in Europe, this list will look somewhat familiar to you. The topics there are very similar to the societal challenges in Horizon 2020, slightly different terminologies, but they're the same type of topics that most developed and industrialized nations around the world are focusing on. They're either tackling, they're challenged by, or they're looking to advance themselves in. And Australia is, like many countries in Europe, focusing on these particular topics. As I said before, the dominance of public funding in the Australian landscape, it gives to some very nice outcomes. One is we are very strong in terms of our publication outputs and citations in that regard. The number of researchers in our workforce is very strong. And compared to other nations that are similar to Australia, we have a very high degree of international collaborations, both with regards to authorship of research papers, but also in terms of projects, and in particular in grants as well. Just a quick pause here for a moment. This map shows you the location of Australia's 39 universities, and as you can see, they're heavily dominated on the east coast. And just so you can see, here is Sydney. Sydney's less than halfway up the east coast, and Brisbane is actually halfway up on the east coast. So our two major cities, Sydney and Brisbane, are also the focus areas of our research efforts, including in the universities, but also in our public research agencies. And most of the country, there's not a lot of population and certainly not a lot of research activity. Not that there isn't any, but it's concentrated in our cities. Looking particularly on ICT, these are some of the areas where Australia has particular niche competencies. and these actually were identified in a report that EPIC produced last year, as well as drawing on some other areas. What may not be familiar to many people outside of Australia is that work that happened in Australia in our radio astronomy field led directly to the development of Wi-Fi, and our strength in that area has led to earlier uptake, development and uptake of various mobile phone technologies, including now 5G. Towards the end of the list here, you can see I've listed the SKA, which is the Square Kilometre Array. Australia is one of the joint hosts of this facility with South Africa, and it is an important global infrastructure, not just for science and for astronomy, but also for ICT. The data and electronics that are required is next generation, and it is a wonderful facility that provides a really good point of collaboration for Australia with international partners, but also for international partners looking to do more with Australia. Now, listed right at the end, an organisation called Data 61, which belongs to our national science organisation. CSIRO is the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation. Data 61 is one of the divisions in CSIRO, and they focus on ICT-related areas, whether it be cybersecurity, whether it be policy. Actually, they had, in the last 2-3 years, they've produced the majority of Australia's policies with regards to ICT and cybersecurity. So it's a very important organisation, and they do research in addition to those other works. So, funding in Australia. Now, like probably most countries in Europe, funding in Australia is reserved for people who are working in Australia. That's not surprising. There are very few countries in the world which are quite happy to give away money to overseas people. However, there are always exceptions, and here in Australia there are a few exceptions as well. But our dominant research funding is to finance research activities here in Australia at Australian institutions. Now, having said that, there are very few restrictions on the nationality of the people who are actually conducting that research. So it's quite common, and for any of you who've been to Australia and visited an Australian research institution, you'll notice there are people from many nationalities who are not citizens of Australia who are participating in funded Australian research. So probably the most well-known funding body here in Australia is called the Australian Research Council. They fund several types of grants. The first one is the Discovery program, where they fund various types of fellowships. And the fellowships here are very similar to the European Research Council grants. So we have fellowships for early career, mid-career, and senior researchers. They'll also fund projects to the tune of around $500,000 for a project. We have a linkage program which is aimed to connect researchers in academia with other sectors of the economy, in particular the business sector, but also the public sector. So there's funding to help facilitate that engagement. And then we have centres of excellence. Now, our other major important funding body is the National Health and Medical Research Council. I mention that here because they fund a lot of medical technology, and a lot of that will include ICT aspects. They do have some restrictions on who can receive funding, but they do have a whole range of grants, some of them which are less restrictive. One of the interesting grants they have, for those of you who are in Europe in particular looking to put together, say, a framework program project, the NHMRC has a co-funding mechanism that allows Australian researchers to be fully funded for their participation in your project. Now, that's particularly nice. That makes Australia a very low-risk partner without having to try and convince the European Commission that they should get funding from Europe's side of things. I'll skip over the CRC centres. Tony will talk about those in a moment. the Department of Industry and Innovation, they have a global innovation strategy under which they have had a few different ways to fund international collaborations. I won't mention them specifically. I've got a link at the end of the presentation. The only reason is we have a new government here, and it's likely that some of those programs will change in substantial ways. But they, in the past few years, they've focused on not just financing international partnerships, but importantly, cross-sectoral partnerships. For example, an SME in Australia collaborating with a university in Europe, or a university in Australia collaborating with an industry partner in Europe, those types of collaborations. The range of funding is quite various. It's been a few $1,000s for travel, up to $1 million for substantial research and commercialisation undertakings. And right at the end of this list, we have the Australia Awards, which provide scholarships and fellowships for people to come to Australia to undertake different research-related activities. They're quite useful, and I've met actually a number of European expats here in Australia who began their Australian journey through an Australian award. They came out as a student or an early career researcher on one of these awards and liked it so much that that led to a career here in Australia. I think I might leave that presentation there with a few links at the end for further information in some of these areas. And if anybody has any questions, we can tackle those after Tony's presented, and I will hand over to Tony right now. Your mic is off, Tony.
How's that? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
Sorry, I had been muted there. Yeah, so away we go. The Cooperative Research Centres program is a small but long-running program. It started in 1990 in Australia, and for European colleagues, it's similar in some ways, but different in others to things like the Fraunhofer program or the leading edge clusters in Germany or the Carnot centres in France. So it's designed to bring universities, other researchers and businesses together. It's unashamedly about applied research, and they tend to be fairly big centres for reasonably long-term goals. So it's a good source of funding for researchers in that they know they have money coming for up to 10 years under the current rules, and traditionally over 7 years they're funded with multiple terms, but now they're up to 10 years with only a single term. Sarah, can we just advance the slide one?
Yes.
Or can I do that from here anyway?
I can do that too. Yep. There we go.
So, and then 3 years ago, a new area was introduced called CRC projects, and I'll talk about them as well. So essentially they're a mini CRC. It's very usual to have foreign involvement in CRCs. I just pulled out the current non-Australian participants in CRCs, and there are 34 different countries represented, 14 of those in Europe, and the biggest collaborating countries with cooperative research centres. There are US partners in 20 of the current 35 CRCs, 11 from the UK. The next largest partner in Europe is the Netherlands at the moment at 5. Denmark, France, Germany all have 4 partners, Sweden 3, Belgium and Italy 2, Austria 2 as well, and then there's a series of other countries with one where they're participating in one CRC. So although it's not specifically designed as a global outreach program, the nature of the problems that CRCs are looking at are always pretty big problems, pretty big opportunities. So it would be unusual now to have a cooperative research centre that didn't have at least one non-Australian entity participating. They can be companies, or they can be universities or other research organisations. Australia's research is heavily invested in the universities. We have a stronger reliance on our universities, one of our strongest sectors here for doing our research, and relatively less on government labs and industry, as Rado said at the start. So in a cooperative research centre, that's an annual funding round running around about in 2 stages from around about May to about November each year. You can apply for up to 10 years, as I said. There's no upper limit on the funding, but there's no lower limit as well. And they do range. There's a $7 million honeybee CRC at the moment that is $7 million from the federal government over 5 years. Now, though, the participants have to match that money. So that CRC is at least $14 million worth of research. It's actually quite a bit higher than that. Through to the largest current cooperative research centre is 75 million Australian dollars over 10 years, so $7.5 million a year. And under the funding rules, you must match that. Doesn't have to be in cash, it can be in kind as well. But in reality, to be competitive in the program, you really do have to cash match. And you need to match the government at much better than one-to-one to be truly competitive in the program. As I said, there's a new program that's like a mini CRCs called CRC projects. So these are single project activities. And these only require 3 participants. 2 of them have to be Australian companies and 1 Australian research organisation, but they can and do have many other partners. That's the minimum, and they very often are involving participants from Europe as well. These are available twice a year. It's a single stage application. It's only about a 30-page application, and to be honest, it's about 5 pages of hard work, the rest CVs and budgets and things like that. The lead company is the recipient of the money, and then they pay out to their collaborators as the work is done. And the decisions and funding are actually very quick in this program. So we're about to start another round. Will be announced by the government in the next probably 2 weeks, and it'll be completely up and running for a 1st of January start next year for those that receive funding. So all the decisions will be made, and the work contracted and money paid within about 6 months. They have a maximum of $1 million from the Australian government up to 3 per year for up to 3 years. With these are not renewable grants. And we're seeing a huge variety in there, from future oyster industry to get rid of a disease of Tasmanian oysters, which has actually been successful, through to the last round that's about to be announced. The successful bidders, there was a priority on artificial intelligence and machine learning in that program. Generally, when the government announces a priority in the area, they've been providing additional money to this program, and so it is a program that's growing, and it is a good opportunity for people to collaborate. Although, as I say, it's not designed necessarily to be a collaboration program. Just by way of examples, I'll pull up slides, and I was rushing for this seminar, so they're not European slides, but it doesn't matter. GC Toothmousse, GC Corporation is actually, well, it is actually now a Swiss headquartered company, but it's originally a Japanese company. And they've worked with Melbourne University to do this research. The intellectual property is a molecule which is trademarked as recalcitrant that pulls calcium and phosphorus into your teeth. And this product is manufactured in Australia in bulk and then bottled and distributed out of Tokyo. Quite a few jobs involved. It's about